The bell over the glass doors of the Ferrari showroom chimed as the midday sun cut through the wide windows and cast streaks of light over polished hoods of red, silver, and black luxury cars that gleamed like gemstones. And that's when it happened, the kind of scene you'd expect to only see in movies or internet clips, because Karen, the infamous woman in our community who had made a reputation for herself by demanding, shouting, and pushing boundaries in every store, office, or neighborhood committee she ever set foot in, walked straight into the Ferrari showroom with her oversized sunglasses perched at the end of her nose, clutching her giant designer bag, clicking her heels across the immaculate marble floor. And within seconds of surveying the luxury vehicles on display, she snapped her fingers to get the attention of the nearest sales associate and declared in the kind of loud, self-assured tone that made people in the showroom freeze, "I'll take one of these, but not for buying. Set me up a 6-month lease immediately." The stunned silence that followed was almost comedic, because everyone knew Ferrari didn't do casual leases, let alone on the terms Karen was tossing around, like she was picking out groceries. If you want to hear how this insane story unfolds, stay tuned until the end. And don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss stories like this again. Because what Karen did next shocked even the most seasoned staff at the dealership and turned the entire showroom upside down. The sales associate, a young man named Derek, who had only been working at the Ferrari dealership for a few months, blinked in disbelief at her demand and tried to compose himself. But Karen wasn't one to wait. She tapped her heel impatiently and gestured at the gleaming red Ferrari Portofino M parked on the platform in the middle of the room, her voice carrying across the space as she said, "That one, yes, bright red. It matches my energy. I don't need to own it, but I'll need it for at least 6 months, preferably delivered to my driveway by this weekend. So let's get the paperwork moving." And Derek, trying to remain polite, began to explain that Ferrari did not operate like a rental company. They sold their cars outright, sometimes with financing, but never short-term leases like she was demanding. Certainly not delivered on a whim, but Karen's face twisted with indignation at his response, like she had just been insulted personally. And she raised her voice again, which made heads turn in every corner of the showroom. Several customers who were browsing quietly suddenly stopped, pretending to check out the interiors of cars, but really listening to the escalating scene. Karen threw up her hands dramatically, saying, "Don't give me that nonsense, young man. I know how this works. I've leased BMWs, Autos, and even a Porsche before. If they can do it, so can Ferrari. And let me remind you, you're speaking to someone with connections in the Homeowners Association. People who know how to make life very complicated for businesses that don't treat residents with proper respect." Derek, flustered, tried to maintain his professionalism, replying, "Ma'am, with all due respect, Ferrari does not do 6-month leases. It's against company policy and brand standards. These vehicles are not available under the kind of terms you're asking for." But Karen slammed her oversized purse on the nearest glass table with a thud, nearly knocking over a vase of roses placed as showroom decor, and snapped back, "Nonsense. Everything is negotiable. Get me your manager." Within moments, Derek scurried off to fetch his manager, a seasoned professional named Marcus, who had been in the luxury car industry for over 2 decades and had seen his fair share of demanding customers. But even he paused at the sight of Karen, who had now stationed herself right next to the Ferrari Portofino, her hand brushing against the mirror like she was already the owner, loudly insisting to another customer nearby that she was just finalizing the terms on her new car, making the poor man nod awkwardly and shuffle away. Marcus approached with his calm demeanor, introducing himself politely and asking Karen to step aside so they could discuss her request more privately. But Karen refused, declaring loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I want this place to know I am serious. I will be driving this Ferrari by Saturday. Either you work out a 6-month lease, or I'll take my money elsewhere, and you'll regret it when the HOA board hears about how I was treated." Marcus, unbothered, gave a practiced smile and explained that Ferrari's business model simply didn't allow for such arrangements. But Karen scoffed, accusing him of trying to gatekeep the brand from real customers like her who actually keep businesses running, which made some of the other clients exchange amused glances. At this point, Marcus had a decision to make, whether to firmly shut down Karen's fantasy deal or let her dig herself deeper by continuing to argue. Karen wasn't backing down, though. She opened her bag and pulled out a thick stack of papers, flipping through them dramatically as if they were financial statements, saying, "Look, I can prove my worth. Here are my accounts. Here are my HOA minutes. Here's a letter from my lawyer. Have no problem paying. I just refuse to be tied down to buying. Why should I buy when I can lease and change cars every season? That's what people of taste do, isn't it? I know better than to commit to a single car when the market shifts so quickly. You need to adapt your business to the modern world." Marcus sighed, his patience tested but still intact, and replied firmly, "Ma'am, Ferrari customers don't lease cars in 6-month increments. That's not how ownership works here. This is not a standard dealership where cars are cycled in and out. When someone buys a Ferrari, they're entering a very exclusive experience, and part of that is commitment." Karen's voice shot back, sharp and defiant. "Exclusive? Ha! I've dealt with exclusivity before. I'll have you know, I am a very important person in my community. People listen to me. People know me. And if you think you can deny me service, you're making a big mistake. I'll make sure everyone knows how this place treats loyal residents." By now, the tension in the room was thick. Derek stood awkwardly to the side, unsure whether to intervene, while Marcus rubbed his temple, and realized this was about to become a long afternoon. Karen was not just another entitled customer. She was ready to dig her heels in and escalate until she got her way, or until she embarrassed herself beyond repair. But what none of them knew at that moment was that Karen's outburst in the Ferrari showroom was just the beginning of a chain of events that would spiral far beyond a simple car dealership dispute. Because Karen's obsession with proving herself, her sense of entitlement, and her willingness to use her HOA influence as leverage would drag her into conflicts she wasn't prepared for. And before long, the whole city would be talking about the Ferrari Karen incident. Karen stood in the middle of the Ferrari showroom, as though the entire building had been constructed solely for her arrival, her eyes darting from one sleek car to the next, with the entitled air of someone who thought ownership was simply a matter of asking. The showroom manager, Richard, a man with years of experience dealing with high-profile clients, quietly motioned for the sales associate, Julia, to stay nearby in case things escalated. Julia had already sensed trouble the moment Karen had burst in without even checking in at the reception desk, declaring that she was there to claim what was rightfully hers. Richard, ever the professional, stepped forward with a calm smile and asked what she was looking for, though deep down he had an idea of where this would go. Karen wasted no time explaining that she needed a red Ferrari convertible, not just for a test drive. She wanted a 6-month lease, immediately, and claimed she was entitled to one since she lived in the most prestigious neighborhood in the city. Richard carefully explained that Ferraris were not typically leased in such short, non-standard terms, and that any lease agreement would require extensive background checks, credit approval, and a contract that followed strict dealership and manufacturer guidelines. Karen's face twisted in outrage, as though she had just been told she was forbidden from entering her own house. "Do you know who I am?" she snapped, her voice echoing through the marble floors of the showroom, drawing the attention of other staff and customers. Julia tried to calm her, explaining that all clients had to follow the same process. But Karen only grew louder, insisting that if she didn't leave with a Ferrari that very afternoon, she would call the mayor, her lawyer, and every news station in town to expose the dealership for discrimination against her. Richard stood his ground, politely reiterating the rules, but Karen wasn't interested in rules. She stormed over to the nearest Ferrari, a bright red F8 Spider, and ran her hand across the gleaming surface as though claiming it as her own, telling everyone within earshot that this was the car she would be driving home in tonight, whether they liked it or not. At that moment, a couple who had been quietly reviewing paperwork for their own Ferrari purchase exchanged concerned glances and decided to leave.
Ouch.
Karen noticed and immediately shouted that they were taking her spot in line, though there was no line and the couple's paperwork had been finalized hours earlier. Richard took a deep breath, weighing his options, realizing that Karen wasn't just an entitled customer, she was a disruption that could escalate into a full-blown crisis. When he gently reminded her that she had to leave the car alone until an official transaction took place, Karen smirked and pulled out her phone, loudly announcing that she was about to make a call that would ruin this dealership's reputation forever. Staff members whispered nervously in the background, knowing Karen's type. They had seen entitled customers before. But this was different. This was someone determined to bulldoze her way past all sense of reason and protocol. The tension she had created seemed to thrive on it, pacing in front of the car like a predator, rehearsing her threats and occasionally shooting smug glances toward the staff as if daring them to stop her. Richard quietly told Julia to contact security, not to remove her but to prepare for what was clearly spiraling out of control. Karen caught the exchange and immediately accused the staff of plotting against her, raising her voice to a near scream, demanding the keys to the Ferrari right then and there. Richard finally raised his hand, his calm demeanor giving way to firmness, and told Karen that her behavior had left him with no choice but to escalate the matter himself if she continued to refuse to cooperate. Karen's lips curled into a mocking smile, as though she had been waiting for this moment. And she dramatically announced that if they wouldn't give her the car, she would take matters into her own hands. She then attempted to open the driver's side door, pulling at the handle as though she could simply climb in and start the engine. Julia gasped, and Richard rushed forward, his voice booming now as he firmly ordered her to step away. The showroom fell silent. Every eye fixed on the bizarre standoff between a woman who believed the world owed her whatever she demanded and a dealership manager who had finally been pushed to the edge of patience. Karen slowly stepped back, but the glint in her eyes suggested this was far from over. She wasn't leaving without causing even bigger trouble, and Richard knew it. The air was thick with tension, the sound of Karen's heels clicking against the floor as she paced in defiance, echoing like a warning that the real storm was still building. Karen's defiance only intensified as Richard tried to re-establish control of the situation, her voice now dripping with venom as she declared that she had every legal right to take the Ferrari, because her tax dollars had contributed to the city, the roads, and everything that makes luxury even possible. The staff exchanged incredulous glances, baffled by the twisted logic she was using, but none dared laugh because the atmosphere was far too tense. Julia tried one last time to gently reason with her, suggesting they sit down at a desk and go over the proper leasing options. But Karen shot her a glare so sharp it nearly cut through the air, snapping that she didn't have time for paperwork, that she had a social gala to attend that evening and needed the Ferrari as her entrance piece. "Imagine me pulling up in that car," she boasted, her tone suddenly shifting to smug arrogance. "People will know instantly that I'm a woman of status, not to be trifled with." Richard folded his arms, his patience unraveling but his professionalism still intact, and explained again that Ferraris were not rented like party accessories, that ownership or leases were binding agreements that couldn't simply be handed out on a whim. Karen's nostrils flared as she stepped closer to him, her heels clicking menacingly on the polished showroom floor, her chin lifted high as though she were staring down a subordinate. "Gosh, if you deny me this, you'll regret it," she hissed, pulling her phone back out and this time actually dialing 911, dramatically announcing that she was being discriminated against, and that a crime of theft was being committed by the dealership because they refused to give her access to her chosen car. Richard blinked in disbelief. Julia gasped audibly, and the two other sales associates froze in place, realizing Karen was really doing it. Within seconds, she was speaking loudly into the phone, embellishing the scene by claiming she was being harassed and cornered, waving her free arm in exaggerated gestures, as though performing for an invisible audience. Customers who had wandered in to admire the cars looked on in stunned silence, some even discreetly pulling out their own phones to record the spectacle. Richard quickly leaned toward Julia and whispered that they needed to prepare for the police actually showing up, because with the way Karen was spinning the story, there was no doubt she would escalate it to make herself look like a victim. Karen ended the call with a triumphant flourish, loudly announcing that law enforcement was on their way and that everyone in the dealership would soon learn a harsh lesson about respecting people of influence. Richard resisted the urge to laugh at her theatrics, but deep down, he also knew this was about to get far more complicated than he had hoped. Karen then sauntered back to the Ferrari, planting herself against the hood as though it were her throne, casually flipping through her phone while humming a smug smile plastered on her face, certain that she had one. The staff exchanged nervous whispers, debating whether to escort her out before the police arrived, but Richard insisted on letting her dig her own hole. If the police saw her mid-tantrum, it would be much easier to explain the truth. Julia, still nervous, pointed out that Karen might escalate further and damage the car, and sure enough, within moments Karen began tapping her fingers on the gleaming red paint, leaving faint smudges that made Julia's stomach twist. Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure, knowing any sudden moves could ignite an even bigger scene. The atmosphere was electric with tension, each second dragging like an eternity, until finally the distant sound of sirens grew louder and Karen's eyes lit up with victory. "Here comes justice," she announced dramatically, standing tall. In front of the Ferrari, like a queen awaiting her guards, Richard exhaled slowly, bracing himself for the storm that was about to crash through the showroom doors, knowing full well that this wasn't just about cars anymore, it was about Karen's need to dominate, and he had no idea how far she was willing to go to prove she was untouchable. The sirens grew louder, and within minutes 2 police officers entered the Ferrari showroom, their presence immediately shifting the energy of the room. Karen rushed forward to greet them, her heels clattering against the marble as she waved dramatically at Richard and Julia, proclaiming in a shrill voice that she had been victimized by the dealership staff who refused her rightful request to lease the Ferrari. She threw her arms wide as if she were performing for a stage, insisting that she had been humiliated and that her civil rights were under attack. The officers, both looking slightly weary as if they had already endured a long day, exchanged skeptical glances before one of them asked her calmly to explain what had actually happened. Karen launched into a rambling tirade about how she had entered the showroom with good faith intentions and was illegally denied service. When she asked for a 6-month lease on the luxury vehicle, emphasizing that she had the means, the connections, and the entitlement to such treatment. She accused Richard of treating her with contempt, Julia of mocking her, the dealership in general of trying to shut out powerful women. Richard finally stepped forward, his voice steady and professional, and gave the officers a clear, factual account of what had transpired, pointing out that Ferrari simply did not offer leases in the manner Karen demanded and that she had trespassed onto the vehicle, smudging it with her hands while refusing to leave. He made sure to speak firmly but respectfully, careful not to fuel Karen's theatrics any further. Julia backed him up, nervously adding that Karen had threatened them multiple times and had even called to accuse them of theft. At this, Karen spun around dramatically, placing a hand over her chest as though mortally wounded, gasping that she was being defamed in front of law enforcement. The officers, visibly unimpressed, told her to calm down and asked to see any documentation proving she had the right to a lease agreement. Karen fumbled with her purse, pulling out nothing but a tangle of receipts and social club invitations, before claiming that her verbal contract was enough. The younger officer sighed and quietly asked Richard if he wanted to press charges for trespassing. But Richard, ever composed, said he would prefer the matter be de-escalated if possible. Karen, however, exploded at the suggestion, her voice rising to a piercing screech as she accused the officers of conspiring with the dealership to strip her of her rights. Customers who had lingered to watch the drama were recording everything, now their phones capturing the spectacle as Karen's meltdown reached new heights. She stomped toward the Ferrari again, placing herself protectively against it, and declared that if she couldn't have the lease, she would occupy the car until justice was served. Julia muttered under her breath that this was spiraling, completely out of control, while Richard tried one last time to reason with Karen, telling her that damaging or obstructing the car could result in criminal charges. Karen's only reply was a smug smirk and the words, "Let them try." The officers, now clearly frustrated, exchanged another glance before stepping forward, their tone sharper as they warned her that if she didn't step away from the car immediately, she would be forcibly removed. Karen raised her chin in defiance, ready to challenge them as the room's tension reached a breaking point. All eyes were on her, the Ferrari gleaming under the showroom lights like a silent witness to her unraveling. as everyone braced to see whether she would back down or ignite the next stage of chaos. Karen's defiance only escalated when the officers warned her to step away from the Ferrari. She planted both hands on the hood as though she could anchor herself to the car, glaring at Richard with triumph in her eyes, and declared loudly that this vehicle was already hers in spirit and that she was not going to let anyone take it away. The officers stepped closer, their voices firmer now, as they explained that interfering with or damaging the car could result in immediate arrest. But Karen seemed fueled by the attention. She turned to the small crowd of bystanders, many of whom still had their phones raised and recording. And she began spinning a narrative that she was the victim of corporate greed, that Ferrari was trying to keep luxury away from the everyday woman, and that the officers were enabling discrimination. Her words came out in dramatic bursts, each one more exaggerated than the last, as though she believed she could turn the audience into her jury. Julia, trembling with a mix of frustration and nervous energy, whispered to Richard that maybe they should just call Ferrari's legal team right away, but Richard held firm, his jaw tightening as he reminded Karen that her antics were being documented not just by the phones of strangers, but also by the dealership's security cameras. When the older officer pointed this out to Karen, she faltered briefly, her eyes darting toward the cameras in the corners of the showroom. Yet instead of backing down, she doubled down, raising her voice and accusing everyone in the room of conspiring against her. At that moment, she yanked her phone out of her purse and announced she was calling her lawyer. Pacing back and forth like she was orchestrating a courtroom drama, loudly proclaiming into the phone, though no one could hear another voice on the line, that she was being unlawfully detained and denied her rights. The officers tried to remain patient, but the younger one finally sighed and moved closer, placing a hand on Karen's shoulder and telling her firmly that she had one last chance to walk out peacefully. Karen jerked away from his touch, shrieking that he had assaulted her, which drew gasps from the crowd and a weary look from his partner. Richard, keeping his composure, addressed the officers again and calmly stated that Karen had disrupted business long enough, and though he didn't want escalation, the dealership couldn't allow her to continue trespassing. Julia added, her voice shaking but resolute, that Karen had not only disrupted, but also threatened them. Hearing that, the officers finally informed Karen that if she didn't leave voluntarily, she would be removed and possibly charged. Karen laughed at this, a sharp, unsettling laugh, and shouted that no one could remove her because she had rights. She then did the unthinkable. She climbed into the Ferrari. Gasps echoed through the showroom as she threw herself into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel as though it already belonged to her. The officers shouted at her to get out immediately, their tone urgent now, while Richard stepped forward, panic flashing across his face as he demanded she exit the vehicle at once. Karen, in a final act of rebellion, pressed her finger dramatically against the ignition button, though the car wasn't activated without the fob. The crowd erupted in murmurs, people whispering about how far she might take this performance. The officers wasted no more time. They pulled open the driver's door and firmly pulled Karen from the seat as she screamed, her cries echoing through the showroom about injustice, corruption, and theft. Phones caught every second. Now flashes from cameras reflecting off the Ferrari's polished surface as Karen kicked and flailed against the officer's grip. Julia covered her mouth in shock, her eyes wide as she whispered that she couldn't believe Karen was willing to go this far just to prove a point. Richard rubbed his temples, his composure cracking only slightly as he muttered that this was going to become a media circus. The officers managed to cuff Karen despite her shrieking protests, that they were destroying her life, and began leading her toward the exit. As they passed by the stunned customers, Karen looked around wildly, shouting at strangers to bear witness to her false arrest and to make sure the world knew how she had been treated. Some of the onlookers chuckled, others shook their heads, but most just kept filming, knowing they were capturing a viral moment. Outside, the flashing lights of the squad car lit up the glass windows, casting a surreal glow over the chaotic scene. Richard sighed heavily, trying to steady himself, while Julia looked pale and shaken, mumbling that it was only a matter of time before this hit the internet. As the showroom slowly returned to silence, all that was left was the lingering echo. of Karen's screams as she was pushed into the back of the police car. Yet even as the doors closed and the officers prepared to drive her away, the sense of unease in the room didn't fade, because everyone knew that with someone like Karen, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a storm that would spread far beyond the showroom walls. The silence that followed Karen's arrest inside the showroom was almost as unsettling as the chaos that had preceded it. Richard stood near the Ferrari, his hand brushing across its gleaming surface, checking for any scratches or smudges left behind by her brief intrusion. Julia, still shaken, whispered that it felt like the entire ordeal had been surreal, like they had just witnessed a theater performance spiraling into madness. Customers who had been frozen in place began dispersing, though many lingered outside. By the glass walls, their phones still raised as they tried to catch the final moments of Karen being placed into the squad car. The flashing red and blue lights outside painted the dealership floor in streaks of color. And Richard sighed deeply, realizing that the real damage wasn't physical, it was reputational. I muttered to Julia that within hours, clips of Karen screaming about injustice would be all over the internet, and Ferrari's pristine image could be dragged through the mud by association. Julia nodded, her lips pressed tight. She admitted she feared the headlines would make it look like the dealership had mistreated a customer rather than protected its staff and assets. Richard, ever composed, said that Ferrari had lawyers for this very reason, but even his voice held a tremor of unease as he acknowledged that no legal team could stop the viral spread of a video. Outside, Karen was still yelling, even as the officers tried to read her rights. She pressed her face against the car window, screaming for people to record her and make sure the world knows. The younger officer, visibly irritated, shut the door firmly, but her muffled cries could still be heard through the glass. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, people from nearby businesses and even passing pedestrians drawn in by the flashing lights. Some chuckled at Karen's antics, while others shook their heads in disbelief, muttering about entitlement and arrogance. One man in the crowd called out sarcastically, "Yeah, sure, 6-month Ferrari lease, totally normal," which earned a ripple of laughter, but even that laughter carried an edge of unease. Back inside, Julia slumped into a chair, her hands trembling as she confessed to Richard that she didn't understand how someone could twist reality so completely. Richard responded with a weary nod, saying he'd dealt with difficult clients before, but never someone so detached from reality, so obsessed with their own version of the truth. He admitted it wasn't just Karen's entitlement that scared him, it was her determination. She had acted like she could bend the world to her will, and even now, being led away in handcuffs, she was still fighting to control the narrative. As the officers pulled away with Karen in the back of the squad car, Richard instructed Julia to lock down the showroom, close early, and ensure that all the staff went home safely. He explained that they needed to regroup before the press, inevitably, descended, and Julia nodded, though her eyes were still fixed on the flashing lights outside. When the last customers had finally trickled out and the heavy glass doors were locked, Richard and Julia sat in the empty showroom together, the Ferrari gleaming silently in the center, as though mocking the storm it had caused. Julia whispered that it almost felt cursed now, that Karen had tainted it somehow. But Richard shook his head and said no, the car itself was pure. A work of art. It was people like Karen who brought chaos into places that were meant for beauty. Still, his words couldn't shake the heavy feeling in the room. Both of them knew Karen wasn't finished. Julia said she wouldn't be surprised if Karen called the local news the moment she made bail. And Richard grimly agreed, adding that she might even file a lawsuit just to keep her story alive. Hours later, after the lights of the squad car had faded and the crowd dispersed, Julia finally left the dealership, but not without glancing nervously over her shoulder, half expecting Karen to reappear. Richard stayed behind a little longer, pacing the quiet showroom and thinking of damage control. He drafted statements in his head, rehearsed how he'd explain the situation to corporate, and even wondered if he should reach out to certain journalists to get ahead of the story. But deep down, he knew Karen would take center stage the moment she got the chance. She thrived on drama, and this incident was like fuel for her fire. As he locked up and finally walked into the night, Richard thought he heard Karen's voice. Echoing faintly in his mind, her shrill declaration that she deserved what she wanted, that nothing and no one could stop her. He shook it off, but unease followed him all the way home, because no matter how tightly he tried to contain it, the chaos she had unleashed was already spreading beyond the walls of the Ferrari showroom. The next morning dawned with a storm of attention that Richard and Julia had dreaded. The dealership's voicemail was already flooded with inquiries from reporters, curious potential buyers, and even prank calls from strangers mocking the 6-month Ferrari lease scandal. Julia arrived early, coffee in hand, only to find 3 news vans parked across the street, their cameras angled at the glass walls of the showroom. She hurried inside, locking the doors behind her, her heart racing as she muttered that Karen had gotten exactly what she wanted: attention. Richard was already there, pacing the floor, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in low, clipped tones with Ferrari's corporate PR team. When he hung up, he told Julia that they were advising absolute professionalism, no comments to the press beyond a prepared statement. And above all, not to engage directly with Karen, no matter how outrageous her claims became. Julia asked what claims he meant, and Richard handed her his phone, showing her Karen's live stream from just hours after being released on bail. In it, Karen sat in her living room, tearfully ranting that she had been humiliated, assaulted, and wrongfully detained by both Ferrari staff and the police, painting herself as the innocent victim of a luxury car conspiracy. Thousands of viewers were watching, the comments split between ridicule and sympathy, but the damage was undeniable. Karen was making herself the star of the story, and the dealership was the villain in her script. As the live stream continued, Karen accused Richard by name, claiming he had manhandled her, discriminated against her for not looking like the type of person who buys a Ferrari. Julia gasped, her hands trembling as she whispered that people might actually believe her. Richard, his jaw tight, admitted that was exactly the danger. They weren't just battling a customer anymore. They were battling a narrative that Karen was actively twisting to her advantage. The police report would eventually vindicate them, he said, but in the court of public opinion, people rarely waited for facts. Julia slumped into a chair, staring at the phone, while outside, reporters began setting up their microphones, waiting for anyone from Ferrari to step outside. Richard called a quick staff meeting, urging everyone to stay inside, stay calm, and let corporate handle the official response. He reminded them that they had nothing to hide, but he could see the worry etched into their faces. No one wanted their workplace to become the stage for Karen's next performance. By noon, Karen herself appeared on the sidewalk in front of the dealership, a small entourage of friends and sympathizers following her. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a stack of papers she claimed were legal documents proving her rights had been violated. Cameras swarmed as she shouted at the locked doors, demanding entry and yelling that Richard and Julia should face her. Julia, watching from the office, whispered that it felt like a siege, while Richard calmly instructed staff to stay away from the windows. But Karen wasn't deterred by silence. She banged on the glass, yelling that Ferrari had targeted her and that she would fight until justice was served. The crowd of onlookers cheered or jeered, depending on which side they favored, and the chaos outside grew louder, more chaotic. Julia clutched her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles went white, whispering that Karen wouldn't stop until something catastrophic happened. Richard, though outwardly calm, shared the same fear. Eventually, the police arrived again, not to arrest Karen this time, but to keep the peace as her gathering threatened to block traffic. The officers urged her to leave, but Karen spun it into more fuel for her narrative, shouting into cameras that she was being silenced again. She finally stormed off, but not before vowing to sue both the dealership and the police department. As quiet slowly returned, Julia exhaled a shaky breath and said she felt like they had survived a battle, but Richard warned her this was just the beginning. Lawsuits, viral videos, relentless harassment. Karen would keep coming back until she either won or destroyed herself in the process. He looked at Julia, his voice steady but low, and said that the only thing they could do was remain stronger than her chaos, hold their ground, and trust that truth would eventually cut through the noise. That night, Richard sat alone in the dimly lit showroom, staring at the Ferrari that had ignited the storm. Its gleaming red body reflected his weary face as he thought about everything that had happened: the entitlement, the lies, the chaos Karen had dragged into their world. He whispered to himself that it wasn't really about the car anymore. It was about control, about one woman's obsession with bending reality to her will and the fight to stop her from destroying everything in her path. He clenched his fists, knowing the road ahead would be long, but also knowing they had no choice but to walk it. The battle with Karen was far from over, and as the shadows lengthened across the polished floor, Richard realized with a chill that this was only the beginning of a much darker story. One that would test their patience, their integrity, and maybe even their sanity. The question was no longer whether Karen would return, was when and what new storm she would bring with her. If you don't want to miss what comes next in this unbelievable saga, make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories, because Karen's fight is far from finished, and the next chapter will be even more shocking.